Hey there, fellow philosopher. Welcome back to another deep dive. We're tackling a pretty big one today. That's right, free will, that age-old question. And, well, to help us navigate this philosophical maze, we've got, as always, an excellent guide, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on David Hume.
Excellent choice.
Hmm.
This isn't just any philosopher, though. I mean, Hume's insights on free will are, well, they're essential reading for anyone seriously grappling with this issue. And we're going deep, folks. We're talking both his treatise of human nature and the inquiry concerning human understanding.
Absolutely. And it's not just about summarizing his ideas either, right? It's about understanding how he walks this tightrope, his compatibilism. The idea that freedom and moral responsibility can actually coexist with determinism. I mean, it sounds paradoxical, but Hume makes a pretty compelling case.
Yeah, and we've got these two main paths we can take to understand Hume's take on all this. Is what we call the classical reading, which was kind of the dominant view for a long time. But then there's this newer naturalistic interpretation that's, well, it's been gaining a lot of traction lately. I think it offers a really fresh perspective on Hume.
As philosophers, I mean, we often get caught up in the logic, the abstract arguments about free will, but I think what's so fascinating about Hume is, well, he brings in these other elements, right? He brings in our emotions, our social interactions. That stuff matters.
Yeah, it's not just about pure reason with Hume, is it? There's a human element there that's often missing in these discussions.
Okay, so let's start with this classical interpretation of Hume. Now, for a long time, he was seen as a key figure in developing this idea of classical compatibilism, a view shared by some pretty big names, like Hobbes, Mill, and even some later thinkers in the analytic tradition.
Right. And what ties these classical compatibilists together is, well, they all recognize that you can't really talk about moral responsibility without first having a clear idea of what a free action is. But here's where they break away from the libertarians, the folks who think free will means being totally uncaused. Classical compatibilists said, no, no, no. Freedom actually requires causation. It's just a different kind of causation.
Wait, freedom requires causation. That seems, I don't know, a little counterintuitive, right? Most
Yeah.
people think freedom means being, free from all constraints, including causal ones.
It does seem a bit odd at first glance, doesn't it? But their point was that an action can be caused by, the agent's internal states, their beliefs, desires, intentions. That's a free action. On the other hand, if an action is caused by something external to the agent, well, that's not free. So it's not about the absence of causation, but the kind of causation that's at play.
So it's not about having this totally uncaused will, but about whether the action is a true expression of the person's, their inner world, their agency.
Exactly. And according to the classical reading, this is where Hume's genius shines through. They saw him as clarifying the concepts of liberty and necessity. It was more about conceptual analysis than, diving deep into empirical psychology.
And Hume himself seemed to hint at this, right? I mean, he pretty boldly claimed that his reasoning puts the whole controversy in a new light because he provides a new definition of necessity.
Exactly. And if you look closely at his writings, especially comparing the treatise to the later inquiry, you can actually see how his thinking on liberty kind of evolved. In the treatise, he distinguishes between two types of liberty. There's liberty of spontaneity, which basically means you can act according to your will without being physically prevented. And then there's this liberty of indifference, which he describes as basically the negation of necessity and causation. He actually points out that the first sense, spontaneity, is the one we more commonly have in mind when we talk about liberty.
So if I want to, I don't know, go for a walk and no one's physically stopping me, that would be an example of this spontaneous liberty.
Yeah. Exactly. But then in the inquiry, he introduces this other concept he calls hypothetical liberty, which he defines as, let me get this right, the power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. And he says that, well, this is pretty much universally granted unless you're, literally imprisoned. But it's important to note that spontaneity and this hypothetical liberty are not exactly the same thing, right? They're related but distinct. Like you could spontaneously want to leave a locked room, but you wouldn't have the hypothetical liberty to actually do it.
Right, that's a good point. Just because I desire to do something doesn't mean I actually have the power to carry it out.
Exactly. And this is actually related to Hume's critique of liberty of indifference, which he kind of equates with just pure chance. He argues that it just doesn't fit with our experience of the world, right? And this is partly why, especially in the treatise, he spends so much time defending the doctrine of necessity, because he sees this idea of radical freedom as just, well, incoherent. But then if you look at the inquiry, he kind of shifts his tone a bit.
Yeah.
He explicitly says that his goal is to reconcile liberty and necessity. Now, the focus on spontaneity is still there, but it's framed more as a reconciliation project.
Okay, so this is where Hume's, famous redefinition of necessity comes in, right? The classical compatibilists see this as the key to his whole argument.
Absolutely. And to understand his take on necessity, you have to understand his view of causation. He says that what we call necessity is really just a combination of two things. First, you have the constant conjunction of objects, the fact that event A is always followed by event B. And then second, you have the inference that our minds make based on this constant conjunction. We observe these patterns, and then we come to expect that B will always follow A. But, and this is crucial, we never actually perceive some kind of, mysterious force or power that connects them.
So our idea of cause and effect isn't based on some, deep metaphysical insight into the nature of reality, but rather on just observing patterns and, well, our own psychological tendency to make associations.
Exactly. And then he applies this same logic to human actions. He argues that, well, our actions are just as consistently linked to our motivations, our character traits, our circumstances. We see these patterns, right? Certain types of people tend to behave in certain ways in certain situations, and we make inferences based on these patterns, just like we do with physical objects. He even gives these examples, about how people from different social classes or genders tend to act differently.
So just as we expect a ball to fall when we drop it because of, gravity, we expect a kind person to act kindly because that's part of their nature.
Yeah, that's the analogy. And then he goes even further. He says that this whole understanding of necessity in human actions isn't just something we observe. It's actually crucial for society to function at all. I mean, imagine if there was no predictable connection between people's motives and their actions. Everything would be total chaos, right? No one could trust anyone. No plans could be made. I mean, it would be impossible to live together.
Right. So he's saying that this kind of predictable order isn't just a description of how things are, but it's also a necessary condition for things like, I don't know, trade, government, even basic social interactions.
Exactly. And he even connects this principle of necessity to, get this, morality and religion. He argues that the whole idea of holding someone responsible, of praising or punishing them, only makes sense if we assume that their actions are reliably connected to their will, their character. Otherwise, if our actions were just random or, determined by pure chance, then, well, it would be like praising or blaming the wind for blowing. It wouldn't make any sense.
Right. If there's no connection between my actions and my inner state, then praising or blaming me for them would be just as pointless as, I don't know, praising the rain for falling.
Exactly. And he even argues that it's precisely through this idea of necessity that our actions can be considered truly praiseworthy or blameworthy. Because, they're not just random occurrences. They flow from our character, which is something we can, to some extent, cultivate. Now, he knows that people often resist this idea of necessity, especially when it comes to human action. But he thinks that's because they misunderstand what necessity really means. They associate it with, some kind of external compulsion. But he's adamant that that's not what he's talking about. He's simply saying that our actions are predictable based on our internal states and external circumstances.
He's not saying we're robots, right? He's saying our actions are predictable, but they're still our actions, flowing from our desires and character.
Right. And so for the classical compatibilist reading of Hume, the bottom line is that causation, understood as constant conjunction, is actually essential for both freedom and responsibility.
Right. That's the core takeaway. But of course, like any philosophical view, it's faced some pretty serious challenges.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely not without its critics.
One major critique is that this liberty of spontaneity, while it, might seem like a kind of freedom, doesn't seem like enough for genuine moral freedom. I mean, Kant famously called it a wretched subterfuge and compared it to, like, the movement of a clock. The clock's hands move according to their internal mechanism, but they're ultimately determined. So the question is, if our will itself is determined, are we really any more free than a sophisticated machine?
Yeah, that's the heart of the incompatibilist argument, isn't it? They say, look, if our choices are just the inevitable outcome of this chain of causes, this causal chain stretching back, who knows how far, then this feeling we have that we could have chosen otherwise, well, it's just an illusion. Even Hume's hypothetical liberty doesn't really solve this, right? Sure, it says if we had willed it differently, we would have acted differently. But the incompatibilist says, yeah, but given the exact circumstances, You simply couldn't have willed differently. They want this stronger kind of freedom, this categorical freedom, where the will itself is free to choose between genuinely open possibilities.
Right, it's that intuition that at any given moment there are multiple paths I could take, and my choice isn't just, a predictable outcome, but a genuine act of self-determination.
Exactly. Another big criticism is that this distinction between internal and external causes, this idea that internal causes are free and external causes aren't, well, it's just too simplistic. It doesn't capture the messy reality of human motivation. I mean, think about compulsive desires like addiction. In a way, you could say the addict is acting according to their internal will, but are they really free in any meaningful sense? These internal causes can feel just as coercive as external chains.
Right, a powerful craving can be just as binding as being, physically tied down.
Exactly. And then there's this final critique, which is that classical compatibilism, with its focus on, the utilitarian justification for responsibility, the idea that punishment is about shaping future behavior well, it misses this other important aspect, this backward-looking aspect of desert, this idea that people deserve to be praised or blamed for their past actions, regardless of the consequences. And this doesn't really fit with a purely utilitarian view, does it? Because on a purely utilitarian view, you could argue that, well, children or even trained animals should be held responsible, and maybe even the dead shouldn't be.
So while classical compatibilism has been influential, it definitely has some holes, some problems that are hard to ignore.
Yeah, it's got its weaknesses, that's for sure.
And this is where the naturalistic interpretation of Hume steps in. And, well, it offers a pretty different perspective, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The naturalistic interpretation, it really shifts the focus. It says, look, the classical reading misses a key part of Hume's thought, this whole idea of moral sentiment, the role of emotions in our moral lives. It's not just about logic and concepts. It's about how we actually feel.
So instead of just worrying about whether determinism and, this particular kind of freedom are logically compatible, the naturalistic view wants to understand how we experience responsibility in a causally ordered world.
Yeah, exactly. And it argues that Hume wouldn't have been happy with this simplistic idea that responsibility just means, acting intentionally. There's more to it than that.
Yeah.
He emphasizes that necessity is essential to morality because it allows us to infer character from actions. And this inference is crucial because, for Hume, being held responsible means being seen as an object of moral sentiments, approval and disapproval.
And these moral sentiments, as Hume famously described them, are like these calmer, more reflective versions of love and hatred, right? They're directed at individuals based on their character.
Right, exactly. They're calm and reflective forms of the indirect passions. And Hume makes it clear that these passions, love and hatred, and by extension moral approval and disapproval, are directed at persons, at thinking beings, not just at abstract qualities. So, we don't feel love or hatred towards, like, the concept of justice, right? We feel it towards individuals who embody certain qualities.
So it's not about the action in isolation, but about what that action reveals about the enduring character of the person who performs it.
Exactly. He's not just interested in fleeting actions, right? He's interested in stable character traits, the kind of things that make someone who they are. And this is where necessity becomes important again. Because in order to feel these moral sentiments towards someone, to approve or disapprove of them, we have to be able to infer their character from their actions. We need that predictable connection. Without it, the whole practice of holding people responsible, of praising and blaming, well, it just falls apart.
So if actions were just random or, totally externally compelled, they wouldn't tell us anything about the person's character. And so we wouldn't have these moral feelings towards them.
Right. Both actions that are completely uncaused, what Hume called liberty of indifference, and actions that are, forced on someone from the outside, both of those would prevent us from focusing on the agent's character. And so the naturalistic interpretation sees Hume as giving us this descriptive account of how responsibility actually works psychologically. It's part of what he called the science of man, which is, trying to understand human nature based on observation and experience.
So it's less about, abstract metaphysical arguments and more about how we actually experience the world, how we actually make moral judgments.
Exactly. And this naturalistic reading of Hume, it's actually quite relevant to contemporary philosophy. Many philosophers today find the classical compatibilist framework a bit too, too thin, too simplistic. And they see this naturalistic interpretation with its emphasis on moral sentiment as a precursor to some really influential thinkers like P.F. Strawson, Strawson's famous essay, Freedom and Resentment. That's a classic.
Ah, yes, Strawson, the guy who really brought this idea of reactive attitudes to the forefront.
Right. And Strawson argued that both compatibilists and libertarians, they both get it wrong because they're trying to find this external metaphysical justification for responsibility. Like they're looking for some kind of logical proof that responsibility makes sense, even if determinism is true. But Strawson says, look, we don't need that kind of justification. Our natural emotional responses, like resentment, gratitude, indignation, these are just built into how we relate to each other. They're just part of being human.
Right, so when someone wrongs me and I feel resentful, it's not like I'm trying to solve a philosophical problem, right? It's just a natural human reaction.
Right, exactly. And while these reactions can be, modified or suspended in certain situations, like if we learn that the person acted unintentionally or under duress, Strawson says we can't just get rid of them entirely, even if determinism turns out to be true. These moral sentiments they're just too deeply ingrained in us. They kind of shield us from this radical skepticism about responsibility that some people worry about.
So if we read Hume through this classical lens, he might seem like one of those optimists that Strawson was criticizing, right? The ones who try to give this kind of, oversimplified account of responsibility.
Right, because the classical interpretation, with its focus on, logical compatibility, it kind of misses this whole emotional dimension, this whole web of interpersonal attitudes that Strawson is talking about. But if you look at Hume through the naturalistic lens, you see that actually he was very concerned with these very human aspects of responsibility. I mean, he might have even gone deeper than Strawson in exploring, the psychological mechanisms behind these moral sentiments.
That's fascinating. So both Hume and Strawson are saying that, well, you can't really understand responsibility without understanding these basic human emotions.
Exactly. And they both reject this idea that responsibility needs some kind of, external justification. It's just part of how we work as social creatures.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about how all this connects to Hume's views on virtue, luck, and what some philosophers call the morality system. The text points out some interesting tensions here.
Yeah, this is where the two interpretations really diverge. The classical view, by linking responsibility so tightly to free action, it kind of ends up endorsing this voluntarist approach to morality. The idea that you're only responsible for what you consciously choose to do. But the naturalistic view, well, it rejects that. It emphasizes that, for Hume, accountability requires actions to be signs of enduring qualities of mind. It's about character, not just isolated choices.
So a single good deed or a single bad deed doesn't necessarily tell us that much about a person. It's about the underlying patterns of behavior, right?
Exactly. And this leads to two really fundamental questions. First, do all virtues have to be, consciously chosen in order to be morally relevant? And second, how much control do we actually have over the development of our character? And Hume's answer to both of these questions is, well, it's pretty much no. He argues that our virtues and vices aren't simply the result of our conscious decisions, and that our character is actually shaped by a lot of factors that are outside of our control.
So if I'm, I don't know, a naturally kind person, it's not necessarily because I made a conscious choice to be kind at some point. It's just part of who I am. Yeah.
Right. And he argues that, even our emotional dispositions, our habitual ways of reacting to things, these are often involuntary. They can even go against our conscious intentions. And then he goes on to say that our character is heavily influenced by all sorts of things we don't choose, like our physical health, our age, our gender, our social circumstances, even things like the climate or the government we live under.
That's pretty radical. So if our character is shaped by all these factors we don't control, doesn't that mean virtue and vice are just matters of luck, like being born with a talent for music or something?
Yeah, that's a common objection to Hume's view. But he says, look, we can still distinguish between virtue and vice based on the qualities people actually display, regardless of how they got those qualities. It's the manifested character that matters.
Yeah.
And our moral sentiments are directed at those manifested qualities. Now, he does acknowledge that we have some capacity for self-improvement. We can try to change our bad habits, but even that capacity is limited, and it might even depend on having some pre-existing virtues.
And this helps explain why he included, natural abilities like intelligence or wit in his list of virtues.
Exactly. He says these abilities, like moral virtues, are mental qualities that tend to produce pleasure and admiration in others, and they're also largely involuntary. So for Hume, the voluntary-involuntary distinction, it's important for, practical matters like punishment, but it's not the fundamental basis of moral evaluation.
So he's challenging this modern emphasis on individual autonomy and conscious choice, right? He's saying that morality is much more complex and messy than that.
Absolutely. And this is where he connects with some contemporary thinkers like Bernard Williams.
Hmm.
Williams criticized what he called the morality system, this idea that morality is all about obligation and blame, and that it requires this total voluntariness in order to be fair.
Mm.
He argued that this morality system tries to create this impossible ideal where our moral standing is completely independent of luck.
Mm.
But Hume, unlike many compatibilists who try to, salvage this idea of free will within a deterministic world, he seems to be more willing to just accept that morality is, well, it's messy, it's influenced by luck, just like everything else.
It's more, down-to-earth view of morality, one that acknowledges the role of fate and circumstance.
Yeah, it's more grounded in human experience, I'd say.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's actually closer to some ancient Greek views of ethics,
Yeah.
which recognize the role of external factors in shaping our character.
That's really interesting. So we've talked about how Hume understands moral sentiment and its role in responsibility, but the text also brings up this question of, well, moral capacity. Why we don't hold everyone equally responsible for their actions. Like, why do we excuse children or, people with certain mental impairments?
Right, that's a good point. And this is where Hume's account, while brilliant in many ways, does seem to have a bit of a gap. He explains how moral sentiments work, but he doesn't really say why they're directed at some individuals and not others. He just kind of says it's a basic fact about human nature.
So he gives us the mechanics of moral feeling, but not the criteria for who those feelings should be directed at.
Right, exactly. And later philosophers, especially those who focus on, reason responsiveness or rational self-control, they've tried to fill this gap. They say that in order to be morally responsible, you have to have the cognitive capacity to understand and be guided by moral reasons. But these theories tend to be more focused on reason and action, which is a bit different from Hume's emphasis on feeling and character.
And the text suggests that Hume might have had this different view of moral capacity, one that's based on his idea of a moral sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. It basically says that for Hume, this ability to feel and appropriately direct moral sentiments, it's actually tied to the development of virtue itself. He talks about how children learn about justice, for example, both by understanding why it's beneficial for society and by feeling the appropriate moral sentiments when it's violated. And it seems like a similar process might happen with, natural virtues as well.
So the development of this moral sense, this ability to feel moral approval and disapproval, it's not just a result of becoming virtuous, it's actually part of the process of becoming virtuous.
Exactly. And Hume also talks about how important it is to be able to see ourselves as others see us, to be able to reflect on our own character and strive for inner peace. This capacity for self-reflection is, for him, crucial for developing virtue. And importantly, moral evaluation for Hume isn't just a matter of gut feeling. It also involves intellectual activity. You have to be able to discern patterns of behavior, to distinguish between different qualities of character, to see things from a more, general and impartial perspective.
So he's not saying that moral judgment is just about blindly following your feelings, right? There's a cognitive element to it as well.
Exactly. And this combination of moral sense and reflection, it's kind of like Aristotle's idea of practical wisdom, this phronesis. It's about having both the right feelings and the right understanding of the situation.
So maybe we can understand why we exempt certain individuals from responsibility by saying that, well, they lack the cognitive capacity for this fully developed moral sense. Like they don't have the intellectual tools to make the same kinds of judgments that a healthy adult can.
Right? That's the idea. And this view of moral capacity, it fits well with Hume's overall emphasis on sentiment and avoids these overly intellectualized accounts of responsibility.
Okay, let's wrap up by talking about, this big one, free will and religion. Hume was pretty skeptical of traditional religion.
Oh, yeah. And he wasn't shy about it either, especially in his later work.
And he noticed how, well, religion has often taken a pretty strong stance in this whole free will debate, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. In the treatise, he actually pointed out how religion tends to favor the idea of liberty of indifference, this radical freedom that he rejects. But interestingly, at that point, he actually argued that his own doctrine of necessity wasn't, a threat to religion. He even suggested that it might actually be beneficial.
He was trying to be diplomatic, not rock the boat too much.
Yeah, I think there was a bit of that going on. But by the time he wrote the Inquiry, his tone had definitely changed. He was much more upfront about the problems his views posed for religion. He wasn't just saying they were compatible anymore. He was basically saying that his view actively undermined traditional religious beliefs.
So what were these problems, these dangerous consequences that he saw?
Well, he basically lays out this dilemma for religious believers. He says, look, if you accept that all human actions are causally determined, just like everything else in the world, and you also believe in a God who's, all-powerful and the creator of everything, then you run into a problem. Because if God is the ultimate cause of everything, including our actions, then either no human actions are really evil, because they ultimately come from God who's perfect, or God himself is responsible for the evil in the world.
Right, it's that classic problem of evil, but framed in a deterministic context.
Exactly. And Hume's response to the first part of the dilemma, this idea that no actions are truly evil, is basically to say, look, our experience of suffering, our moral feelings of disapproval, these are real, they matter to us as humans, regardless of what some grand theological scheme might say.
So even if everything ultimately serves some, divine purpose, our human experience of good and evil is still valid and meaningful.
Exactly. And then, when it comes to the second part of the dilemma, the idea that God is responsible for evil, he gets even more pointed. He uses this analogy of someone who sets off a mine, intentionally. He says that the person who set off the mine is ultimately responsible for the damage it causes, even if the explosion itself is just a mechanical process. And he applies this to God. He says that if God is the ultimate author of our actions, then he's also responsible for the evil that we do. And if God is responsible for evil, well, then he can't be perfect.
Wow, he doesn't pull any punches there.
No, he doesn't. And what's interesting is that he also suggests that, well, if God is the author of our actions, then we're not really responsible for them. But, that doesn't really square with his naturalistic view, which says that moral sentiment is just a basic part of human nature. I think his main point here is to show that this traditional religious view, when combined with determinism, leads to this really impious conclusion that God is the author of sin and therefore blameworthy.
So he's using the free will debate to critique traditional religious beliefs to show how they lead to these absurd or even offensive conclusions.
Right. And he argues that, well, we should judge God based on the evidence we have, the world we observe. And if the world is full of suffering and evil, then that tells us something about the nature of God. He was basically saying that we can't just, invent these abstract theological ideas to explain away the problem of evil. We have to face the reality of human experience.
He's really pushing for a more, empirically grounded view of religion, one that's consistent with our observations of the world.
Exactly. And this is all part of his larger project, which is to demystify morality and social life, to show that they don't depend on these traditional religious beliefs.
Yeah.
He wants to ground them in human nature, in observation, in experience.
And free will is, well, it's a key part of this project, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's right at the center of it. I mean, his whole naturalistic framework with its emphasis on, sentiment, causation, constant conjunction, all of that, it's all about rejecting this traditional view of the world that's based on, immaterial souls and divine intervention and all that. Yeah. He wants to replace that with a view that's based on what we can actually observe and understand about ourselves and the world around us.
So to bring it back to our listeners, those deep thinkers out there, I mean, we've explored these two interpretations of Hume, the classical and the naturalistic. We've talked about moral sentiment, about virtue and luck, about the problem of evil. It's been quite a journey, right?
It has. And, for our philosopher listener, the one who's really wrestling with these issues, I think the question is, well, which interpretation of Hume resonates most with you? Which one helps you make sense of your own experience of free will and moral responsibility?
And beyond that, I mean, does Hume's naturalistic approach, this emphasis on emotion and social interaction, does that suggest that our whole understanding of free will needs to change? Do we need to move away from these purely abstract metaphysical debates and ground our thinking more in the realities of human experience?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that Hume himself would have been happy to see us grappling with. He was all about challenging assumptions, about pushing us to think more deeply and critically about these fundamental issues.
Absolutely. And for those who want to, continue down this rabbit hole, I mean, there's a whole world of thought out there. I mean, Strawson is a great place to start. And of course, Bernard Williams. And there's so many contemporary philosophers who are still engaging with Hume's ideas in really fascinating ways.
There's always more to explore.
And that's what philosophy is all about, right? Keep questioning, keep thinking, keep digging deeper.
Exactly. That's what we're all about here at The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.